Ladies and gentlemen, we have a problem. This is not the kind of problem we can ignore, because it concerns our financial future. There is no easy fix, because we've neglected to deal with it for so many years. If we had to describe this problem in one word, that word would be debt. During the past few decades, Western governments, led by the United States, took on huge amounts of debt. Debt in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it is invested wisely in the construction of infrastructure, which will serve the country and help its economy grow. However, the United States and other Western nations have used debt in order to finance their current expenses. Generations upon generations of legislators on both sides of the aisle treated the public purse as an unlimited resource. They used it to fund endless wars across the world and distribute generous handouts to their voters. As of this moment, the US national debt is over $32 trillion, but by the time you watch this video, the figure may increase, since it is growing at a dizzying rate. Economists are generally not impressed by the size of the debt. They argue that the figure itself is unimportant, as long as the economy is growing proportionally. But even if we take the GDP into account, the picture does not get any prettier. The US debt to GDP ratio currently stands at roughly 120%, higher than it was at the end of World War II. It has grown steadily since the early 1980s, and there is no reason to believe that this trend is about to change. $1 trillion is a number so big that it's difficult to imagine. For instance, if we had to pay $1 trillion at the rate of $1 per second, it would take 31,709 years. There is no way the US government can ever repay this debt. This would require it to cut its budget and increase taxes so drastically that it would completely collapse the economy. As a matter of fact, its leaders have no intention of ever repaying the debt. They are certain that they can continue to increase it indefinitely and that there will always be someone to lend them the money. After all, the dollar is the global reserve currency, and all countries across the world need it in order to trade. But now the debt has become so huge that the US government is having trouble even servicing it. During 2022, the Federal Reserve has begun to raise interest rates in order to fight inflation. This has caused interest payments on the debt to skyrocket from an annual rate of $500 billion in 2020 to almost $1 trillion today. This amount is only expected to increase as a growing share of the national debt reaches maturity and needs to be refinanced at a higher rate. This expense will consume more and more of the budget, putting the federal government in danger of insolvency. Why should you care about that, you may ask? Well, because the US owes this money first and foremost to us, the ordinary citizens who save every month and whose pension funds are invested in US treasuries. So how did the greatest superpower on earth reach such a miserable state? It didn't happen overnight. For many years, central banks across the world have steadily reduced their interest rates. This was inspired by the Keynesian theory, which nowadays dominates the field of economics. According to this school of thought, whenever a crisis occurs, the central bank must cut interest rates in order to encourage corporations to borrow money, develop new products, and hire new workers. However, according to this theory, at the end of the crisis, interest rates should return to normal levels. In practice, this didn't happen. Time and time again, central banks were slow to raise interest rates. Once they finally did so, a new crisis had already begun, and they were forced to cut them down again. These unnaturally low interest rates allowed governments to take on more and more debt. In the aftermath of the subprime crisis of 2008, when interest rates were already close to zero, and there was no way to cut them down any further, central banks devised an even more radical measure. They called it quantitative easing. But in fact, it was nothing more than good old money printing. They used this money to purchase government bonds, thus depressing their yield. The purpose of this policy was to direct the flow of capital into the stock market in order to generate a wealth effect and encourage the public to consume. At first, this manipulation seemed to work well. The S&P 500 index broke records and investors saw huge returns. The public became more confident to invest and consume, and the economy appeared to recover. But underneath the surface, something dangerous has begun. The newly printed currency started leaking from financial assets into the real economy, generating inflation. This process was slow at first, and this allowed the central bank to deny its very existence. But after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the rapid expansion of the money supply which followed, it became apparent to all. Inflation has spiked to levels the likes of which we haven't seen in 40 years. Central banks had no choice but to raise interest rates in a desperate attempt to stop the inflation they themselves have created. But since the US national debt is so large, the federal government cannot endure these higher rates. As we have already explained, interest payments are putting a strain on the federal budget. As a result, bond investors across the world are becoming concerned about the fiscal trajectory of the United States. This has recently prompted the Fitch rating agency to downgrade the US credit rating from a perfect AAA to an AA+. The Biden administration, however, is refusing to see this as a warning sign and continues to issue record amounts of debt. Generally speaking, an insolvent government has two options on its hands. The responsible course of action is to publicly acknowledge its insolvency. In this case, it will need to enter negotiations with its creditors on reducing and restructuring the debt. It will also need to cut its spending and balance the budget, since no one will be willing to finance its deficits any longer. This usually leads to a deflationary crisis, in which the money supply contracts. Such a crisis is undoubtedly painful and leads to a deep recession. However, history shows that in the long run, this approach is less harmful to the population and that within a few years, the economy is able to recover. If the United States ever reaches this situation, it will probably cease to be the leading superpower, and its citizens will have to settle for a lower standard of living. Wall Street will no longer be the financial center of the world and may lose much of its power. However, the demand for basic goods such as food and clothing will not disappear, and it will move the economy forward. Eventually, things will improve, and life will continue, although more modestly than today. Unfortunately, there is another, much more dangerous alternative. Instead of declaring bankruptcy, an insolvent government can simply print the currency it needs to pay its creditors, or more accurately, have the central bank print the currency and purchase whatever amount of debt that is needed. This does not prevent the crisis, it only turns it into an inflationary one. After all, as the money supply expands, the supply of goods and services remains the same. Therefore, more and more currency units are needed to purchase the same amount of goods. Those who pay the price for this are the citizens, whose cost of living rises and whose savings lose their value. If the government persists with this policy, the situation becomes unbearable. Strikes and protests paralyze the economy as frustrated workers demand higher wages. At this point, the government may try to curb inflation through price controls, but this only leads to shortages of basic goods and the emergence of a black market. In an extreme scenario, inflation may get out of hand and turn into hyperinflation. Contrary to popular belief, Hyperinflation is not a lot of inflation. Hyperinflation is the result of a loss of confidence in the national currency. After a long period of time in which salaries are eroded and prices of basic goods are rising precipitously, people may try to get rid of the currency altogether. They will convert their savings into any available commodity, simply because tangible goods hold their value better than cash. This leads to a collapse in the value of the currency, until it becomes completely worthless. In the absence of a stable medium of exchange, the economy grinds to a halt. All long-term projects are cancelled, and people are only concerned with daily survival. What little trade remains takes place in the form of barter, just like in ancient times. Pensioners and people who rely on government benefits are completely impoverished. The human suffering is immense. The scenario I've just described may sound imaginary, but in fact it has taken place many times in the past. For instance, in Germany, during the Weimar Republic, or in France, after the French Revolution. Even today, hyperinflation exists in countries such as Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Lebanon. No country is immune to such a disaster if it adopts irresponsible economic policies. But if previously this phenomenon took place on a local scale, today we're facing a much greater danger. Since the dollar is the global reserve currency, we may experience a global hyperinflation. Such an event will affect each and every person on the planet, whether they hold dollars or not, because it has the potential to completely disrupt international trade. Instead of living in a modern, globalized economy, we may find ourselves forced to rely on local goods practically overnight. For those of you who are not aware, the majority of US dollars, both in paper and digital form, are held outside the borders of the United States. That is a basic feature of any global reserve currency. Until recently, this has been the main source of the American power and wealth. No matter how many dollars the Federal Reserve has issued or the federal government has spent, there has always been a demand for them overseas, which helped keep inflation in check. But if the international community ever loses faith in the dollar, all of this currency will find its way back home, generating hyperinflation without the Federal Reserve needing to print a single dollar. As you can see, we are living in perilous times. Events which are taking place on the world stage today are threatening to destroy our very way of life. In order to get through this tumultuous period, preferably with our capital intact, we must keep a close look on what is happening and be ready to react accordingly. Here at the Silver Hermit, we will help you do that with a careful and thoughtful analysis of the global macroeconomic situation. So please subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends and family. Hopefully, together we will reach a safe harbor.